The rope slipped from Cashin's hands as the horse bucked wildly beneath him. In that terrible moment, as he flew through the air toward the hard-packed earth, his hat sailed off his head. Long auburn hair spilled down like liquid fire, catching the morning sunlight. The 20 cowboys watching from the fence fell deadly silent. Their eyes widened in shock as they stared at the figure picking himself up from the dust. The person they'd worked alongside for 6 months, the person who could break horses better than any of them, the person they'd shared campfires and stories with, was not who they thought at all. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Cashin's chest rose and fell rapidly, not from the fall, but from pure terror. The binding cloth around her chest had loosened in the tumble, and she quickly crossed her arms to hide the telltale curves. Her voice, which she'd kept low and rough for so long, came out as barely a whisper. "Please," she said, her real voice soft and desperate. The cowboys exchanged glances, their faces showing confusion, anger, and something else. Betrayal. They'd been fooled completely, and in the unforgiving world of 1880s Montana, that meant everything was about to change. Foreman Jake Thornfield pushed through the crowd, his weathered face twisted with rage. His gray eyes, usually kind when he looked at the young man he'd grown fond of, now burned with fury. "You lying piece of—" He stopped himself, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles stood out like cords. 6 months. 6 months you've been living in the bunkhouse with my men, eating our food, taking our wages. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. What kind of woman does that? The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to shame and hurt. The other cowboys began muttering among themselves, their voices growing louder and angrier by the second. "She's been watching us dress," one said, his face red with embarrassment. "Listening to our private talk," added another. "What else has she been lying about?" The questions came fast and hard, each one making Cashin flinch. She'd known this day would come eventually. She just hoped she could save enough money first, could prove herself enough that maybe, just maybe, they'd understand. But looking at their faces now, she realized how foolish that hope had been. Ranch owner Samuel Morrison emerged from the main house, drawn by the commotion. He was a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for fairness, but his expression hardened when he saw the scene before him. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed immediately. Jake pointed at Cashin with disgust. "This here's not a man, boss. This is some lying woman who's been playing us all for fools." Morrison's eyes moved to Cashin's flowing hair, her crossed arms, her terrified face. The disappointment in his expression cut deeper than any anger could have. "Get her off my land," he said quietly. Now, 6 months earlier, Cashin Hartwell had stood outside the gates of the Morrison Ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of desperate hope. Her real name was Cassandra, but she'd shortened it to Cashin to sound more masculine. She'd practiced walking like a man, talking like a man, even spitting like a man during the long journey from Colorado. Her younger brother Tommy lay dying in a Denver hospital, and the doctors wanted $200 for the surgery that could save his life. $200 might as well have been $2,000 for a woman with no family and no prospects. The binding cloth around her chest made breathing difficult, but it was necessary to hide her feminine shape. She cut her beautiful hair short and jagged, rubbing dirt into it to dull the auburn shine. Her father's old clothes hung loose on her slender frame, and she'd stuffed rags into the shoulders to broaden her appearance. When she spoke, she kept her voice in her throat, making it rough and deep. She practiced for weeks until it sounded natural. Every morning, she reminded herself, walk with your shoulders back, take up space, never apologize for existing. The first test came when she approached Jake Thornfield for work. The foreman looked her up and down with shrewd eyes, noting the soft hands and smooth face. "You look young," he said suspiciously, "and green. You ever worked cattle before, boy?" Cashin forced confidence into her voice. Yes, sir. Worked my family's ranch in Colorado until the drought took everything. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had helped with ranch work as a child. I'm stronger than I look, and I learned fast. Just give me a chance to prove myself. Something in her desperate sincerity must have reached him, because Jake nodded slowly. Wages are $30 a month, plus food and a bunk, Jake said. Work starts before dawn, ends after dusk. You'll mend fences, brand cattle, break horses, and do whatever else needs doing. Miss a day of work, and you're gone. Cause trouble with the other men, and you're gone. Lie to me about anything, and you're gone. Each condition felt like a weight settling on her shoulders, but Cashin nodded eagerly. $30 a month meant she could save Tommy's life in less than 7 months. She could do this. She had to do this. The bunkhouse was exactly what she'd feared. A long, low building filled with narrow beds and the smell of unwashed men. 20 cowboys called it home, and they eyed the newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that greeted all strangers. Cashin chose a bed in the corner, as far from the others as possible. That first night, she lay awake listening to the snores and muttered sleep talk of men who had no idea they were sharing their space with a woman. Every sound made her heart race, terrified that someone would discover her secret before she even had a chance to prove herself worthy of keeping it. The first month was the hardest. Cashin's muscles screamed in protest as she learned to rope cattle with hands that had been meant for gentler work. Blisters formed and burst and formed again on her palms. Her back ached from hours in the saddle, and her shoulders burned from hauling fence posts and wire. But slowly, painfully, she began to build the strength and skill she needed. More importantly, she began to earn the grudging respect of the other cowboys. They saw her get back up when horses threw her. They watched her work through pain without complaint. Gradually, their suspicion turned to acceptance. Old Pete Martinez became her first real friend on the ranch. He was a weathered Mexican cowboy with kind eyes and a gentle way with horses. When he saw Cashin struggling with a particularly difficult knot, he showed her an easier method without making her feel stupid. Trabajo duro, he would say approvingly, hard work. Pete had a way of seeing past surfaces to the heart of a person. He never questioned why Cashin was so private, why he never joined the others when they went to town on Saturday nights, or why he was always the first to volunteer for extra shifts that meant more time alone. The breakthrough came during a terrible storm in her second month. Lightning split the sky as cattle scattered in panic across the range. Most of the cowboys huddled in the bunkhouse, but Cashin grabbed her horse and rode out into the chaos. She spent the entire night in driving rain, gathering frightened steers and guiding them back to safety. By morning, she'd saved nearly 50 head of cattle that would have been lost or killed. Jake found her at dawn, soaked to the bone and exhausted, but still working. That was cowboy work, he said simply, and from that moment, she was truly one of them. The other men began including her in their card games and conversations. She learned to curse like they did, to laugh at their rough jokes, to share stories around a campfire. She became especially good at listening, letting others talk while she stayed safely in the background. They told her about their families, their dreams, their fears. She ached to share her own story, to tell them about Tommy waiting in that hospital bed, but she couldn't risk it. Instead, she made up stories about a fictional family in Colorado, always keeping the details vague enough to avoid being caught in lies. By the third month, even the most suspicious cowboys had accepted her completely. They trusted her to watch their backs during dangerous work. They shared their food with her when supplies ran low. Some even began to see her as a younger brother who needed protection and guidance. The irony was bitter. These rough, sometimes crude men showed her more kindness and respect than she'd ever received from the respectable society that had turned its back on her when she needed help most. She was living the biggest lie of her life, but she'd never felt more accepted or valued as a person. As summer turned to fall, Cashin's deception became more complex and dangerous. She'd grown skilled at the countless small tricks that kept her secret safe. She always changed clothes in private, claiming modesty that the other cowboys accepted with good-natured teasing about city boys. She volunteered for night watch duties that let her sleep apart from the others. When nature called, she found excuses to ride out alone. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it was working. She'd saved nearly $60, and Tommy's letters from the hospital gave her strength to continue. The first real scare came when cowboy Billy Hawkins got drunk and decided to give the young pup a lesson in manhood. He cornered Cashin behind the barn one evening, reeking of whiskey and looking for trouble. "You're too pretty for a man," he slurred, reaching out to grab her face. "Maybe it's time someone taught you how to be tough." Cashin's heart hammered as she dodged his clumsy hands. But before things could go further, Pete appeared with several other cowboys. They hauled Billy away, laughing about his drunken foolishness, but Cashin had seen something dangerous in his eyes that worried her deeply. Her closest call came during a trip to town for supplies. She was loading feed sacks when she heard a familiar voice calling her real name. "Cassandra? Cassandra Hartwell, is that you?" Her blood turned to ice as she recognized Mrs. Ellen Foster, a family friend from Colorado. The older woman approached with a confused smile. "My dear, what are you doing dressed like that? And your beautiful hair, what happened to it?" Cashin glanced around frantically, grateful that none of the Morrison cowboys were nearby. She had to think fast, or her entire world would crumble. "Please," Cashin whispered urgently, grabbing Mrs. Foster's arm. "You can't say anything. My life depends on it." She quickly explained about Tommy's illness and her desperate need for work. Mrs. Foster's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to deep sadness. "Oh, you poor child," she murmured. "What a terrible choice you've had to make." But she was a practical woman who understood the harsh realities of life. "Your secret is safe with me," she promised. "But be careful, dear. If these men discover your deception, they won't see it as noble sacrifice. They'll see it as betrayal." The warning haunted Cashin through the autumn months. She began to notice things she'd missed before. The way some of the cowboys' eyes lingered on her face, the occasional puzzled frown when her voice cracked slightly, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Billy Hawkins, in particular, watched her with increasing suspicion. He'd started asking pointed questions about her past, testing her stories for inconsistencies. She could feel the net of her deception growing tighter around her, but she was so close to her goal. Just a few more months, and she'd have enough money to save Tommy's life. The weight of living a lie was taking its toll in ways she hadn't expected. She'd grown genuinely fond of these men who'd accepted her as one of their own. Jake had become like a father figure, offering guidance and praise that warmed her heart. Pete was the brother she'd never had, loyal and protective. Even the younger cowboys looked up to her, seeking advice about work and life. The knowledge that she was deceiving people who trusted her created a constant ache in her chest. She told herself it would all be worth it when Tommy was well again. But late at night, staring at the bunkhouse ceiling, she wondered what kind of person she was becoming. Winter brought new challenges that tested every aspect of Cashin's carefully constructed identity. The work became harder as they moved cattle to shelter and repaired storm damage. But more dangerous than the physical demands were the emotional complications that began to threaten everything she'd built. Jake's eldest son, Michael Thornfield, returned from college back east, and his arrival changed the entire dynamic of the ranch in ways Cashin could never have anticipated. He was handsome, educated, and kind, exactly the sort of man she might have dreamed of in her real life as Cassandra. Michael was 25, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see more than most people. He'd spent 4 years studying agriculture and business, preparing to modernize his father's ranching operation. Unlike the rough cowboys, he spoke softly and treated everyone with respect, regardless of their position. When he met Cashin, he showed the same courtesy he'd give to any ranch hand, but there was something in his manner, a warmth and interest that made her heart race dangerously. She found herself looking forward to their conversations about ranch improvements and new cattle breeding techniques. The problem was that Michael clearly enjoyed her company as well. He sought her out during meals, asked her opinion on various projects, and even invited her to join him for evening rides to survey the property. You have good instincts about the land, he told her one sunset evening as they sat their horses on a hill overlooking the valley. Father says you're one of his best workers. The pride in his voice made her chest tight with emotion. If only he knew the truth, that she was a woman deceiving everyone, including herself, about these growing feelings. The attraction was mutual and impossible. Cashin found herself stealing glances at Michael's profile as he spoke, admiring the way his hands moved as he gestured, treasuring the rare smiles he gave her. But every flutter of her heart was followed by crushing reality. She was living as a man. Even if she told him the truth, what future could they have? She was a woman who'd spent months sleeping in a bunkhouse, working alongside men, deceiving an entire community. No respectable man would want her after that, no matter how noble her reasons had been. The situation became almost unbearable when Michael began confiding in her about his personal life. One evening, as they mended fence together, he spoke about his loneliness and his desire to find a woman who could understand the ranching life. The ladies back east think ranching is romantic, he said with a rueful laugh. They don't understand the reality of it, the hard work, the isolation, the constant worry about weather and prices. I need someone who truly understands this life. Cashin's throat tightened as she realized she was exactly what he was looking for, but in a form he could never accept. The cruel irony was devastating. As winter deepened, Cashin's emotional turmoil began affecting her work performance. She found herself distracted during dangerous tasks, making small mistakes that could have serious consequences. When she nearly got trampled by a spooked horse because she wasn't paying attention, Jake pulled her aside for a stern conversation. "What's gotten into you lately?" he demanded. "Your head's been in the clouds for weeks. If you can't focus on the work, you're going to get yourself or someone else killed." She promised to do better, but the warning shook her deeply. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not when she was so close to saving Tommy. Billy Hawkins had been watching her increasingly odd behavior with growing suspicion. He'd noticed how she never joined them in the bathhouse, how she always found excuses to change clothes privately, how her voice sometimes slipped into higher registers when she was emotional. One day, he confronted her directly. "There's something strange about you, Cashin," he said, cornering her in the feed room. "Something that don't add up. Maybe it's time we got to know you better." His eyes were cold and calculating, and Cashin realized he was actively hunting for her secret now. She deflected his questions with nervous jokes, but she could see he wasn't satisfied. The stress was affecting her health. She'd lost weight from worry and poor sleep, making her already slender frame look almost gaunt. The binding cloth around her chest had begun causing sores that never healed properly. She was constantly exhausted from the emotional effort of maintaining her disguise while battling her growing feelings for Michael. Pete noticed her distress and offered quiet support, though he didn't know its source. "Sometimes a man carries burdens he can't share," he said wisely. "But carrying them alone can break even the strongest back." His kindness made her want to weep with gratitude and guilt. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal blizzard that trapped everyone in the bunkhouse for 3 days. Tensions ran high as 20 men were confined in close quarters with nothing to do but talk and play cards. Billy had been drinking from a hidden bottle and was in a particularly nasty mood. He began making pointed comments about secrets and people who ain't what they seem. Michael was present, having come to check on the men during the storm, and Cashin could see him starting to pay attention to Billy's insinuations. Her heart pounded as she realized how close she was to complete exposure. "Some folks," Billy continued, his words slurred but his intent clear, "they come to a place under false pretenses. They lie about who they are, what they want, why they're really here." His eyes fixed on Cashin with malicious satisfaction. Makes a man wonder what else they might be lying about. Several other cowboys were nodding thoughtfully, and Cashin could see doubt creeping into faces that had once shown only acceptance. Michael was frowning, his intelligent eyes moving between Billy and Cashin with growing concern. She realized that her time was running out, and when the truth finally came out, it would destroy not just her job, but every relationship she'd built on this ranch. The blizzard finally broke, but the atmosphere in the bunkhouse remained cold and suspicious. Billy's pointed comments had planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger each day. Cashin noticed cowboys watching her more carefully, testing her reactions with casual questions about her past. Even Pete seemed puzzled by her increasingly evasive behavior. She tried to act normal, but the constant vigilance was wearing her down. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield, each question a potential trap that could expose everything she'd worked so hard to hide. Michael's growing attention became both a blessing and a curse. He sought her out even more frequently, clearly enjoying their friendship, but his presence made her heart ache with impossible longing. During one evening conversation, he mentioned that his father was considering promoting some of the ranch hands to supervisory positions. "You'd be perfect for it," he told her earnestly. "You understand the work, the men respect you, and you have natural leadership qualities." The praise should have thrilled her, but instead it filled her with dread. More responsibility meant more scrutiny, and she couldn't afford either. The situation spiraled further when Tommy's letters from the hospital took a desperate turn. The doctors were losing patience with a delayed payment, and his condition was worsening. "They say if I don't have the surgery within the month, it might be too late," he wrote in shaky handwriting. "Cassie, I'm scared. I don't want to die, but I can't keep hoping if there's no hope left." The letter arrived during her lunch break, and she barely made it to the privacy of the stable before breaking down completely. The sobs that racked her body were too deep and raw to hide, but she didn't realize Billy Hawkins had followed her until it was too late. Well, Billy's voice came from the stable entrance, filled with triumph and malice. "Ain't this interesting? Big tough cowboy crying like A." He stopped, his eyes widening as he really looked at her. In her emotional breakdown, Cashin had forgotten to maintain her masculine posture. Her shoulders had curved inward, her hands covered her face in a distinctly feminine gesture, and her sobs were high and desperate. Billy stepped closer, his expression shifting from mockery to shock to something darker. "You ain't a man at all, are you?" he whispered, his voice filled with dangerous certainty. Cashin's blood turned to ice as she looked up at Billy's face. There was no point in denying it. He'd seen too much, understood too much. "Please," she whispered, her real voice coming out soft and pleading. "Please don't tell anyone. I'll leave. I'll go tonight. Just don't say anything." But Billy's smile was cruel and calculating. "Oh, I ain't telling anyone yet," he said slowly. "See, this information is valuable. Worth something, if you know what I mean." His implication was clear and disgusting, and Cashin realized she'd traded one kind of danger for another. Billy held her secret now, and men like him always found ways to use power over others. Billy's demand started small, but grew bolder each day. First, he wanted her to do his share of the unpleasant chores: mucking stalls, cleaning tack, hauling water for the horses. When she complied without complaint, he escalated to more personal humiliations. He would whisper crude comments about her body when no one else could hear, making her skin crawl with revulsion. He took pleasure in watching her squirm, knowing she couldn't protest or fight back without risking exposure. "You're my secret now," he told her with a leer, "and I plan to make the most of it." The worst part was how Billy's newfound confidence affected the other cowboys. They noticed his increasingly arrogant behavior toward Cashin, but misunderstood the reason. Some began to think Billy had some legitimate grievance against the quiet young cowboy, and their sympathy shifted in his favor. Pete tried to intervene once when Billy was being particularly cruel, but Cashin couldn't explain why she didn't defend herself. "Stand up for yourself," Pete urged her privately. "Don't let him push you around." But how could she explain that fighting back would mean losing everything? Michael's presence became torture as Billy grew bolder about making suggestive comments when the boss's son was nearby. During one particularly awful evening, Billy made a crude joke about pretty boys that was clearly directed at Cashin, causing several cowboys to laugh uncomfortably. Michael's face darkened with disapproval, but when he looked at Cashin for her reaction, he saw only pale resignation. "Are you going to let him talk to you that way?" Michael asked later, clearly disappointed by what he saw as cowardice. Cashin's heart broke as she saw respect fading from his eyes, replaced by confusion and loss of regard. The crisis came to a head when Billy cornered her in the feed room after everyone else had gone to dinner. His demands had been escalating toward the inevitable, and Cashin could see in his eyes that he was done with small humiliations. "Time for you to show me just how grateful you are for my silence," he said, reaching for her with hands that promised violence if she resisted. But desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. When he lunged forward, she grabbed a pitchfork and held it between them with shaking hands. "Stay back," she warned, her voice cracking with fear and determination. "I'd rather tell them myself than let you touch me." Billy's face twisted with rage at being defied. "You think you're too good for me?" he snarled. "You're nothing but a lying whore who's been fooling decent men for months. When I tell them what you really are, they'll throw you off this ranch so fast your head will spin. And then everyone will know exactly what kind of woman you are." His threats hit like physical blows, but Cashin held the pitchfork steady. She realized in that moment that her choice was simple: expose herself on her own terms or let Billy destroy her completely. Either way, her time at the Morrison Ranch was ending, but at least she could maintain some dignity in how it happened. The confrontation with Billy had shaken Cashin to her core, but it also brought clarity she'd been missing for months. That night, she sat in the stable with Tommy's latest letter, reading his weak but determined words. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me, Cassie. I'd rather die than know you destroyed your life trying to save mine." Her little brother's courage shamed her into facing a truth she'd been avoiding. She'd been holding on to this deception not just for his sake, but because she'd found a place where she belonged, where she was valued and respected. Losing that felt like dying, but living Billy's victim felt worse than death. The next morning brought the horse-breaking session that would change everything. Cashin had been working with a particularly difficult stallion for weeks, earning the animal's trust through patience and gentle persistence. The other cowboys gathered to watch, impressed by her skill with horses that most of them couldn't handle. Michael was there too, leaning against the fence with admiration in his eyes as he watched her work. For a moment, as she felt the horse respond to her touch, Cashin allowed herself to imagine this could last forever. Then the stallion spooked at something only he could see. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion. She felt herself leave the saddle, saw the ground rushing up to meet her, heard the collective gasp from the watching men. But worse than the impact was the terrible moment when her hat flew off and her carefully hidden hair tumbled free. The silence that followed was deafening. 20 pairs of eyes stared at her in shock, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and dawning understanding. The woman they'd worked beside, eaten with, trusted with their lives, had been lying to them every single day. Jake's face went through a terrible transformation as the truth sank in. The affection and pride he'd shown for his best young cowboy curdled into something ugly and hurt. 6 months, he said, his voice shaking with rage. 6 months you've been in that bunkhouse with my men. 6 months of lies. The other cowboys began muttering among themselves, their voices growing angry as they thought about all the times they'd been vulnerable around her, changing clothes, talking about private matters, treating her like one of the brotherhood. The sense of violation was palpable and painful to witness. Michael's reaction was the hardest to bear. The disappointment and confusion in his eyes cut deeper than all the others' anger combined. He'd trusted her, confided in her, maybe even begun to care for her as a friend. And now he was learning it had all been built on deception. "How could you?" he asked quietly, and the quiet hurt in his voice was worse than shouting would have been. Cashin tried to speak, to explain about Tommy and the money and her desperate circumstances, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she make them understand that her lies had come from love, not malice? Samuel Morrison's arrival sealed her fate. The ranch owner took one look at the scene. The woman with tears streaming down her face, the angry cowboys, his son's stricken expression, and his face hardened into stone. "Get her off my land," he said with quiet finality. "Now." There was no appeal in his tone, no room for explanation or forgiveness. Cashin rose shakily to her feet, her whole world crumbling around her. She'd known this day would come, but she hadn't been prepared for how much it would hurt to see hatred in faces that had once shown her kindness and acceptance. As the cowboys dispersed, muttering angrily among themselves, only Pete remained behind. The old Mexican cowboy looked at Cashin with sad but understanding eyes. "Mija," he said softly, using the Spanish word for daughter that revealed he'd suspected her secret all along. "Why didn't you trust us with the truth?" His gentle question broke the dam of emotions she'd been holding back. Through her tears, she told him everything about Tommy dying in the Denver hospital, about the $200 she needed for his surgery, about the desperate choice that had led her to this deception. Pete listened without judgment, his weathered face growing more compassionate with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Love makes us do impossible things," he said finally. "But lies, even ones born from love, they have a way of hurting everyone they touch." He helped her gather her few possessions from the bunkhouse, shielding her from the hostile stares of the other cowboys. As they walked toward the gate, he pressed something in her hand, a small leather pouch heavy with coins. "For my savings," he said when she tried to protest. "For your brother." At the ranch gate, they encountered Michael waiting with his horse saddled and a travel pack secured to his saddle. His face was troubled but determined. "I'm going with you to Denver," he announced, his voice steady despite the confusion in his eyes. "Not because I approve of what you did, but because Pete told me about your brother. No child should die because adults are too proud to help." Cashin stared at him in shock, unable to believe that after everything, he was still willing to help her. "Why?" she whispered. "After all the lies, why would you do this?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Because I've been thinking about all our conversations, all the times you listened when I talked about loneliness and finding someone who understood this life. You never lied about who you were inside, did you? You just lied about what you looked like on the outside." His words were like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "I don't know if I can forgive the deception," he admitted honestly. "But I can't let an innocent boy die because I'm hurt and confused." The journey to Denver took 3 days, during which Cashin, now finally able to be Cassandra again, told Michael everything about her life, her dreams, her desperate love for her dying brother. With each mile, something shifted between them. The walls built by deception began to crumble, replaced by genuine understanding and respect. When they reached the hospital and Tommy saw his sister with a handsome man who'd helped save his life, his weak smile was radiant with joy. "You found someone good," he whispered to Cassandra. "Someone who sees your heart." 6 months later, Cassandra Hartwell married Michael Thornfield in a small ceremony attended by Pete Martinez and a fully recovered Tommy. She wore her hair long and beautiful, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that celebrated rather than hid her femininity. The ranch hands from Morrison's spread were noticeably absent, still angry about the deception. But Jake had eventually come to understand and even grudgingly respect what she'd done for family. As Michael placed the ring on her finger, Cassandra thought about the terrible choice that had led her to disguise herself as a man. She'd lost friends and dignity along the way, but she'd saved her brother's life and found a love built on truth rather than illusion. Standing there in her wedding dress, finally free to be exactly who she was, she knew every sacrifice had been worth it. Like and subscribe for more incredible Wild West stories that will leave you speechless. Click the video on your screen now to discover another tale of courage, deception, and love that changed everything in the frontier. Don't miss these amazing stories that prove truth really is stranger than fiction.